Welcome back to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin, here with something special for you today. We're going to have a literary discussion, and I'm joined by two novelists, two friends. The first is a friend of the podcast as well, not just a friend to me, and that's Joshua Hren, who is the founder and editor at Wise Blood Books. He teaches at University of St. Thomas in Houston in the MFA program, and is a novelist who wrote this novel right here for our viewing audience, Blue Walls Falling Down, which we discussed on a recent episode of the podcast. Joshua, glad to have you back. How are you?
I'm glad that we have an excuse to have another conversation.
Yeah, let's keep doing it. Keep reading
Thank you
good
so
books,
much.
and we'll just keep coming back together and talking about them.
Keep writing novels and we'll
Exactly. I'm also joined today by Trevor Cribben Merrill, who is a novelist as well. He has written a novel for Wise Blood Books called Minor Indignities. He has a PhD in French literature from UCLA. And we just bumped into each other recently at Notre Dame at the great Catholic Imagination conference that was just hosted there. And so, Trevor, glad to have you on the podcast and to have this discussion. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, the topic that's bringing us all together today is the novel, I guess, that's bringing us all together today is this one, again, for our viewing audience. It's called Annihilation, and it's written by Michel Houellebecq. For those who are unfamiliar with Michel Houellebecq, he is a controversial French novelist and a great French novelist. Um, I'm sure we may get into some of his other books in the course of our discussion of this one, his newest one, Annihilation, which was published in French in 2020 and then translated, or the translation into English was published this year, 2024. But just a word from me about how I discovered Michel Houellebecq. I discovered Michel Houellebecq probably, I don't remember when, probably around 2017 or so. And the first novel that I read from him was called Submission, which is one that a lot of people have read and has definitely gained a certain popularity, notoriety. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it is a really important novel, I think. And it's funny. I'll get your impression, guys, about this. But when I read that novel, I really felt like it was kind of like a secret thing that you had to do. Like I sort of felt like it was sort of transgressive to read that novel at the time because the novel is about France and a situation where a kind of Islamic party is able to gain control of power in France. And the main character is this intellectual who isn't particularly Christian, isn't particularly anything, but finds himself in this situation where he's kind of given the opportunity to continue to be a person of influence, provided that he converts to Islam. So anyway, there's so much more to say about that novel. But since that time, I have found that novel has gained kind of a more mainstream appeal. I mean, it seems to me like it's perfectly respectable to like that book now, and perfectly respectable for the most part, I think, to like Michel Houellebecq. So here we are talking about him, and we're going to get into Annihilation in a second. But maybe we could just go around and starting with you, Joshua, just talk about your experience of reading Houellebecq up to this point.
Yeah, I mean the experience that you just described, I think kind of cracks open the way in which in a kind of liberal democratic society we oftentimes think that free speech is real and that it exists and that our own ability to engage with whatever art or ideas we wish to is real. But as Plato himself seems to know very well, in a democratic society, there is actually a kind of unspoken ceiling in the sense that there's a lot of kind of self-censorship that will come uh, in response to potential responses to your own desires, I guess, or your own sort of uh, your own embrace of insights that are outside of kind of what are acceptable and on a mass scale at any given moment. And so I do think that reading him is refreshing in the sense that he is kind of completely exploding some of these categories that are kind of straitjackets on both thought and the advancement of the art of the novel simultaneously. And, I think that, for example, I mean, what other novelist is talking to Le Figaro and saying something like he said a few years ago, when a country, a society, a civilization gets to the point of legalizing euthanasia, it loses all, in my eyes, all right to respect. It becomes henceforth, excuse me, not only legitimate, but desirable to destroy it so that something else, another country, another society, another civilization might have a chance to arrive. And then a couple of years after that, and this is sort of a segue into one of the main themes of Annihilation, which is euthanasia. He also, in Harper's, again, I'll say it again, in Harper's, uh, he wrote an essay called The European Way to Die, which is a sort of a critique of the soft totalitarianism and the Nietzschean kind of last man way of being that is embodied in things like the UK's recent decision to legalize euthanasia and to not just legalize it, but seemingly encourage it and foster it. And he really mourns very beautifully, I think, that what you're losing when you cut short the end of a life is this kairos time, this unprecedented and unrepeatable last moment that is meant to be set aside as a time of reconciliation and farewell with loved ones and with enemies. And Houellebecq says it's both impious for those who believe and immoral for anyone else to cut short this time. So again, what's fascinating is that this critique and this appeal to the beauty of a happy death is coming not from the usual suspects within the culture war, for example, but from a novelist of kind of great skill who's operating, at least for all known purposes, outside of an explicitly kind of religious or Catholic tradition, although obviously his novel is deeply Catholic just because it's an embodiment of Europe, an embodiment of France in particular. So yeah, those are some some of the things that I think kind of make him really important as a figure.
Yes, I discovered Houellebecq quite a few years before I became Catholic. I think I had just graduated from college, and I encountered his name in a book by the French writer Philippe Solers, who described him as a sort of up-and-coming writer who still had a lot to learn, but was worth paying attention to. And so I think soon after that, I read Houellebecq's first novel, which is titled Whatever in the English translation, but I think the French title of the novel is much more evocative, L'extension du domaine de la lutte, the extension of the domain of the struggle. And it's a book about sort of anonymous functionaries who are making some multiple of the minimum wage, and so are doing okay financially, but their love lives and sexual lives are extremely impoverished. And it's a sort of a book that flirts with being a thesis novel. It's bitterly funny, somewhat cynical. It seems at times to be wallowing in its own darkness and bile. And I have to say that I didn't find it tremendously appealing. I read it, but it didn't make a deep impression on me. I'm not sure that I really understood at the time the implications of its thesis or quasi-thesis. But I was curious enough that when Houellebecq's sort of breakout novel was published, The Elementary Particles, and in fact, it may have been at about the time that I discovered him that novel came out. I remember checking a copy out of the Somerville Public Library and reading it again with a mixture of interest and maybe a sense of I'm not sure that this novelist is really for me. And then it was quite some time later that my doctoral dissertation advisor, actually, who has written some very interesting things about Houellebecq on his blog, recommended that I read some more of his novels. And I had a couple of friends who were into him too. And so I went back to him. And like you, Andrew, and like Joshua, I think maybe you had the same experience. Reading Submission was a really, uh, you know, eye-opening experience. I'd been living in France, and I guess there had recently been some terrorist attacks, one of which happened to coincide with the release of that novel, sort of adding to Houellebecq's aura as secular prophet who had predicted the rise of the incel, and then also sort of had his finger on the pulse of Islamic terrorism, and then seemingly in a later novel had predicted the yellow vest movement in France, and so on and so forth. But by this time, I was also mixed up with a group of French writers who run this review called the Atelier du Roman, the novelist workshop. And Houellebecq is a contributor to that review, and the editor of the review, who's a Franco-Greek literary critic named Lakis Progidis, has actually interviewed Houellebecq and is sort of, in some sense, close with him, at least in a literary way. And so I was my first sort of encounter with Submission, even though I think Houellebecq had been recommended to me as a kind of important figure and diagnostician of the disasters of liberalism, as I think Joshua just kind of found these very choice quotes in his First Things review of Annihilation, and I think that's one of them. Despite this sociological side to Houellebecq, I think I first encountered him as sort of a member of this team of people who were just really into the European novel and into the idea of exploring the European novel as a kind of literary accompaniment to the whole European project. And so my first my first true encounter with him was reading Submission, and I think I read that book seeing Houellebecq as a novelist, less than as a sociologist or the author of sort of thesis novels. And that was it was a very happy combination of expectations and reality, because I think that novel is in some sense Houellebecq's most successful fusion of sort of his worldview and the form of the novel. And I think it really works as a novel. There's something very mischievous and novelistic about it. So I guess my overall position on Houellebecq would be that we should try to read him as a novelist, despite the many other ways that he can be interpreted. I think his self-understanding, in some sense, is that he is attempting, or maybe gloriously failing, to carry on the project of the realist novel, the Balzacian realist novel.
Yeah, I would just follow up on that by remarking on his interview with the Paris Review, where he says, "You can only observe and describe." Right? He says, "I'm not a reactionary, as everyone seems to think that I am. I'm just looking around very attentively and observing what I see and describing it." And then he goes on to say, "I've always liked Balzac's very insulting statement that the only purpose of the novel is to show the disasters produced by the changing of values. That's what I do. I show the disasters produced by the liberalization of values." So I would suggest that there is actually a kind of affinity between some of these remarks that he's making in Le Figaro or in Harper's in a more discursive way or in a more kind of didactic way, and his novelistic explorations of these same themes or questions. I think that it's a travesty that especially people who are, as Katie Carl would put it, kind of over-prepared to read the novel are kind of wary of talking about the themes of novels, almost like that's something that we could do when we were in our 8th grade literature class, but it's kind of passé once you really figure out what literature is about or something like that. And I think that what Trevor's getting at is I would suggest to kind of develop that is that it's not that he's setting aside these kind of moral and spiritual concerns to pursue some sort of art for art's sake, that is contained within a story that should have no real referent or bearing on the reality of the world as we all live and move in it and try to figure out how to interpret it, but rather that he's always going to get at these things in a much more persuasive, more fulsome, more indirect and subtle way that has the power to kind of create or produce insights and epiphanies that oftentimes will be lacking when you're just trying to wrestle with something like the culture of death face to face, head on. An example of that I would point to, just kind of moving to toward the novel itself, Annihilation, is one of the subplots of the novel is that the protagonist, Paul Raison, his father, who worked for the French government in intelligence, has suffered a stroke, and it has sort of felled him, but not entirely killed him. And there's a moment, for example, when Cécile, Paul's sister, who's a devout Catholic, is waxing eloquent about the power of prayer, and she insists that through prayer their father might be saved. And then a few pages later, we find out that in fact he does not die. But there's no direct indication that yes, you can trace an immediate line between her prayer and her father not dying. Another example of the way in which the novel as a form deals with these things is later on when his father is institutionalized to die a state-sponsored happy death, which ends up being kind of a hideous ordeal where you have people walking down the hallway with their legs stained with feces and things like that. They try to, in wrestling with how to respond to his father's demise, Paul collaborates with an underground organization that was founded by a Baptist, I think an American Baptist, which is devoted to basically breaking people out of the prison of hospitals that are intending to kill them early. And so in one of the kind of most metaphysically thrilling heists of all contemporary literature, you have Paul and this anarchistic underground worker devoted to fighting euthanasia breaking his father out of the hospital that's supposed to be healing him and helping him. But the way in which Houellebecq treats that specifically in a novelistic way that makes it more satisfying is that the particular man that they're collaborating with is himself an atheist. He's an unbeliever. He's not a Baptist like the founder. So the novel sort of is so good at getting at these unpredictable and indirect insights. I'll just cite one more while we're talking about it, which is again another very beautiful moment when Paul's, and this is a very novelistic thing. It just goes back to all of the 19th century novels where there's a kind of deathbed scene, or and why is the deathbed scene so important? Because again, as the 19th century novel knew so well, that's where you have to kind of make your amends and reconcile yourself with God and your fellow man. And when Paul is doing so with his father can't respond to him. So there's this really rich kind of moment of him being able to make a confession to his father and to say things that he has always wished that he could articulate, but that his father is unable to respond in kind. And one of the things that he finds himself confessing, almost, if not against his will, certainly beyond his own understanding, is that he wishes that he, Paul, and his wife Prudence would have had children, and he has remorse for their neglect in not bringing life into the world. And it startles him and it shocks him, and it actually shocks the reader at that point in the novel too. And this is what's so amazing about this form, is that right then we are arrested by his own arresting kind of insight or epiphany.
Yeah. That's great, Joshua. Thanks for all of that to kind of draw us into the novel itself and some of the important characters and themes. As you say, we're not too grown up to talk about themes in novels, so let's do that. A couple more things. First of all, I forgot to mention that one of the things that's brought us together for this conversation is that the three of us have not only read the novel, but each of us has offered a reflection in the media about this novel. Joshua wrote a piece for First Things, Trevor wrote one for Compact, and I wrote one for Catholic World Report. So that's three of us. I don't know if there are more of us in kind of the Catholic. The Catholic media world who have weighed in yet on at least in English on this novel. I guess there probably are a few, but we
It
can
was
say
not
that.
mentioned in the homily, over the last few weeks. I didn't hear any of the.
You didn't hear any mention of people writing about this in the media?
Well, yeah, yeah, and in the homilies at the masses that I've attended, surprisingly, it
Right.
wasn't all the rage. It wasn't all.
No, right. It's not. And there may be, we should say, I mean, this is something that, I run into all the time in my own writing and podcasting and things is, there will certainly be Catholics who won't find reading Welbeck particularly edifying or appropriate even. But I don't agree with that. Maybe we can talk about that. But let's get into Annihilation a little bit. So Joshua's already mentioned that we have at the heart of this book a family drama. Now it's a story set in the near future in France. It feels like the present. It's set in 2027. We're almost there. But it imagines, as most of Welbeck's novels do, a kind of pretty realistic kind of scenario where we can see things going, or if it's too outlandish, it's only barely, maybe only barely, right? And so what we find in this novel is this sort of there's this kind of vague terrorist threat in the world that seems to be focused on France, but has other sort of nefarious destination or whatever. It has other destinations for its malice. Um, I don't know if you guys feel this, but I found that stuff to be interesting and important, but in the end, not that important I mean, it sort of, to me, kind of, it was there. It was interesting as far as like, here's the world that this family lives in. But then I got very deeply drawn into what's going on in the family. Now, Joshua, you've already talked about the situation with the father who is this intelligence officer. He knows even about these particular plots that I was just mentioning, but he's stricken. He's paralyzed. He can't speak. But I wonder if we could transition. Well, we can talk a lot more about him, but I would love to focus a little bit on Paul, the protagonist, Paul Raison, and his wife Prudence. So they're married. They have had 10 years of nothingness together, basically. I mean, they pass like ships in the night. They don't have a sexual relationship. And somewhat miraculously, I mean, maybe this speaks to what you were saying before, Joshua, about prayer and how all of that works. But their relationship comes alive again. Now, Prudence is a new age sort. She is interested in Wicca, but it's not very clear that it's sort of the really, I don't know, maybe this is controversial of me to say, but it doesn't sound like the really evil kind, like the kind that maybe is sort of in the background of these terrorist plots or whatever. I don't know. But just as you said, Joshua, that they've gotten to a place in their marriage in their life. They're 50 and they can't have children anymore. But it's only now that their kind of marital life comes back to life. And in a sense, like that's a beautiful thing about the book and a hopeful thing about the book, I felt. But it is also part of the tragedy of the book because this love that comes back alive ultimately comes alive too late to be procreative, too late to kind of transform the world in a way. So I'll just say that, and then just throw it to you, Trevor, maybe to go back around the horn the other way to get your thoughts on that and take it in any direction you want in terms of the kind of the family drama.
Yeah, I guess, maybe because I did have a fairly critical take on the novel, not entirely critical take on the novel. It might be good for me to start with some of the things that I think the novel succeeds at doing. And I agree with you, Andrew, that the relationship between Paul and Prudence is very moving, and the timid rediscovery of their love for each other after this 10-year drought is handled very beautifully. And I think some of the key moments actually take place in the childhood bedroom of Paul Raison, who has gone back to the family homestead because of his father's sudden illness. And so they sort of tenderly rediscover each other in this decor of childhood memories and posters of The Matrix on the bedroom wall. And even though I think the causes of the reawakening of their romance are a little bit obscure, it, it does seem that somehow Prudence's dabbling in New Age philosophy has encouraged her to seek out or try to reawaken her feminine side. There's also a moment when she puts up a Christmas tree, and I think he perceives this as a sort of welcome overture, an invitation for them to return to some kind of common life. All of that, as sort of underdetermined as it is, I found rather convincing and ultimately fairly moving. I did think that Houellebecq's emphasis on sort of the wife prancing around in lingerie and the sort of, again, his characteristic emphasis on the sexual dimension of their romance, I sort of, it was somewhat persuasive to me, but always accompanied by kind of tenderness that was very, very, yeah. Just,
could I just interject really quickly? I want you to continue, but just really quickly on the sexual thing. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this was an area where I felt like Annihilation was very different from some of his other books, because the way that sex works in his other books tends to be, I have found anyway, as a kind of like just, a kind of, why not? The world is just so dead and exhausted anyway. Sex is just a kind of, it's this sort of expression of deadness. Whereas I felt like in this novel, it was the return to the sex life of this married couple was a real, I don't know, it was a celebration of life in a way, even though, as I said, the tragedy is that it can't be procreative. And then, there's other mitigating factors too, namely Paul's illness, but which we may get to. But anyway, I just felt like sex worked differently, a little bit differently in this book than in some of his other
But
ones.
could I just really, again, before going to
Yeah.
Trevor, just one other thing on that point. I mean, I definitely in my review, I think this part was edited out, but I had a little parenthetical remark about, maybe some of the passages were gratuitous in that regard. I don't think that many of them were, but maybe just a few. As opposed to other contemporary novels that tend to deal with this, is not just a sort of a few stray lines. It's entire pages that are just gratuitous and not serving the story. This was definitely serving the story. I admit that I found it perplexing or mysterious in terms of how exactly, because he goes with some level of specificity into even sexual positions that are changing as their relationship begins to rekindle. And it seemed like there was some sort of meaning that he was driving at in terms of their shifting sexual positions, and I couldn't quite make sense of it. So sorry, Trevor.
Yeah, well, at the risk of going too far into this topic, this is a section of the novel that I found very successful, was when the narrator is describing Raison's sort of sexual preferences with regard to positions. And because of his illness, I think this is towards the end of the novel, he's somewhat incapacitated. And his wife exhibits a sort of tremendous generosity in the way that she relates to him. But he sort of prefers to lie on his side. But then Houellebecq kind of goes on this riff where he says, like, actually, this was generally true of Paul. He liked when he swam, he preferred the side stroke. And it could be said of Paul Raison that he lived life on his side. And I thought that was actually a very sort of beautiful way of getting us into the metaphysical essence of Paul's character. Yeah, I didn't think that the sex scenes were terribly gratuitous. Sometimes it just seemed to me, and I agree that the sexual relationship between husband and wife is a beautiful thing uh, to uh, to cherish in a novel like this, if it's done with delicacy, which it isn't always done with delicacy in this case, but I think to a great degree, much more so than in some of Houellebecq's other novels. But sometimes I did have the sense that for Houellebecq, a kind of uh, sort of almost return to a sort of teenage uh, uh, experience of sexuality could become a kind of proxy for marital love. Um, and so I didn't find the relationship between Paul and Prudence to be entirely satisfying in the way that it was drawn. Um, but I still overall would maintain that it's the most successful part of the novel. It's the part that I found most moving. I would add as well that I thought that the depiction of um, Paul's younger brother, or Aurélien. And you made a very interesting observation, Andrew, in your review about the uh, profession of Aurélien, who is involved in restoring medieval tapestries. And I think your observation was that somehow this was like a sort of almost a fruitless effort to resurrect or conserve France's distant past in the face of these forces of annihilation. And that was something that I hadn't quite picked up on, but I think that's very apposite. But I think Houellebecq is very successful in showing how, as Orleans' marriage disintegrates, and he encounters this other woman who is a caretaker who is involved in caring for, and then actually involved in the sort of exfiltration of Paul's father. So he has this very beautiful and promising relationship with this young African woman, and meanwhile his marriage is disintegrating, and his sort of wife is quite sadistic in her attempts to humiliate him. And then at a certain point, I don't want to give any spoilers, but Aurélien succumbs to despair, and I thought that Houellebecq, without really seeming to try, was able to convey the pointlessness of that despair and the tragedy of it and the futility of um, that young man's very unhappy life. And so I thought that was another very successful part of the novel.
A couple of things to kind of draw out of the relationship between Paul and Prudence, and then its interconnectedness with the larger trajectory of the novel. So on the one hand, I think that Andrew and Trevor, you've both spoken eloquently about the love plot, right? The restoration of their marriage, which just in terms of the overall shape of the novel makes up most of the latter half. Whereas the sort of the political thriller plot comprises most of the first part of the novel. Then the latter half is the restoration of their marriage, and we kind of narrow in on their relationship to the point that much of the rest of the world falls away. And I think that there are actually multiple ways of reading that. One could be just, again, in the grand old tradition of realism, it's just realistic that when one is dying, that, urgent political concerns that you could have actually done something about and put your hand to the plow to change are outside of your power. And so the rest of the world kind of falls away. Another way of reading it is that in spite of the genuine goods of their restored marriage, there is an excess kind of solipsistic collapse into their sex life at the expense of the rest of the world, at the expense of everything else that they could be being attentive to. And so I think both of those are possible readings. I would also just say that there are other really interesting kind of interconnections, though, between what I'll just for shorthand purposes call the political and the marital plots of the novel. Early on, Houellebecq describes the hospitals as like a totalitarian citadel grafted onto the heart of the city. The new modern buildings come with the accoutrements of childhood. Sorry, this isn't just hospitals, it's sort of just general architecture of the forward looking, so to speak, kind of architects of France. Uh, like a totalitarian citadel grafted onto the heart of the city, the new modern buildings came with accoutrements of childhood, a fun hospital, a Lego hospital, a toy hospital, replete with domestic animal workshops. And, I couldn't help but chuckle because I remember in teaching undergraduates, suddenly around midterm and final exam times, all these therapy dogs started to appear around campus. And I couldn't help but, well, I had to hold myself back from vomiting because of the level of infantilization that embodied and encouraged. And this sort of larger infantilization, this question or dramatic representation of the larger infantilization of French culture and society, I think is also tethered to Paul's return to his childhood home in a way that is not just sort of like a one-to-one Euclidean parallel lines, right? Or something like, I think that there's a mystery here, and I don't want to kind of try to interpret it in an over easy manner because sometimes there's just the technique of montage is in and of itself a kind of invitation to further contemplation rather than a kind of just analyzing it to death. And when Paul returns to his childhood home, not only is there a Matrix poster on the wall, but there's also, I think there are either albums or a poster of Nirvana, right? So uh, Kurt Cobain makes an appearance, a cameo in the novel. And here again, we have both the kind of Lego-like buildings of French society and Paul returning to his childhood home. Does this mean that Paul is actually regressing into a kind of infantilized state in his return there? Or is his return there an opportunity to kind of build new memories that will replace uh, the sort of less satisfying ones that he previously made there? And this, I think, also ties us then back to one of the great themes of the relationship between Paul and Prudence, which is his smittenness eventually with her committedness to a kind of new age Wiccanism that involves kind of a theology of reincarnation. And so I'd just like to say a few words about that. I actually found in my reading that there was potentially, again, more of an intentional kind of doubling or potential even collusion between Prudence, Paul's wife's pursuit of Wicca and her belief in reincarnation, and also the political the plot of the novel. We didn't mention this, but in the political plot of the novel, there are these mysterious terroristic attacks that keep happening, and one of them attacks a Chinese container carrier. So the question among the French intelligence workers are, does this mean that it's an anti-capitalist campaign, right? One of them attacks a sperm bank. So then you're thinking, oh, wait, this is not anti-capitalist. This is clearly traditional Catholics or something like that who are behind this attack. And then there's this really one, I think maybe the most disturbing of them all. Well, the most disturbing of them all is that there's this boat with 500 refugees headed from Africa to Europe who are all just killed, right? And what again with great novelistic skill, this is how the novel can get at these things in a way that a newspaper article can't, right? We have this metalhead, right? He loves heavy metal music, and he's working with the French intelligence uh, to realize and to teach everyone else that if you map the location of these different terroristic attacks, it actually forms a pentagram. And that this is all tied with the pentagram is tied with the satanic figure of Baphomet. And actually, in the middle of the novel, there's this kind of fold out image, a full page illustration of Baphomet and of the pentagram. So the novel is clearly kind of, again, calling attention to those elements. But to what end is not clear. I mean, on the one hand, the intelligence officers don't know what to really do with this because they just say, uh, Satanists and Catholics are basically in the same general ballpark because they both believe in sort of supernatural realities, unlike most of us. Um, but then on the other hand, actually, Paul's wife, Prudence, who's an official of the Treasury, she reveals that the pentagram is also used by Wiccans. And so I just can't help but wonder whether there's some sort of hint or suggestion that there could be a link between kind of the deep state and these terrorists. I don't know that that is definitively what he's saying, and I would never claim that. But there's also this way in which, right, earlier on in the novel, Paul even has further sympathies with and affiliations with the terrorists when he says, right, in this misanthropic mood when he's reflecting on all of these terrorists' heists, he says he couldn't entirely blame them. He couldn't entirely blame them. And this is just really chilling and kind of unsettling. But then we also have to remember that that isn't the position that he remains in for the rest of the novel, because when his relationship with Prudence is restored, which also is paired with his own dealing with serious illness, then I don't think that he becomes quite as kind of sympathetic with an annihilation of that kind. But then if I could just make one final remark on this point, I do think, to follow this thread through, I do think that toward the end of the novel, there's a greater kind of hesitation that I have with regards to the nature of their rekindled marriage, because it's not just as simple as, this is a kind of an ascent to life or a kind of celebration of their marital life vis-a-vis the culture of death that surrounds them and that he was previously sympathetic to. Instead, I think that their marriage, as he grows closer with her sexually, he also grows closer with her spiritually. And what this means is that he begins to long for this state of what he describes as samsaric existence, so a kind of a samsaric reincarnation, to pass to the other shore, that of illumination, of timeless fusion of the soul with the world, that is to say, of the soul with annihilation. So nirvana, right, which there's there's the sort of the Kurt Cobain nirvana, the grunge band version of nirvana, on the one hand, that he moves back into his childhood room to witness. But there's also this longing for a spiritual nirvana. And as Joseph Ratzinger says in Truth and Tolerance, this understanding of this longing of nirvana is troubling precisely because this suggests that the way of enlightenment is a way into non-being. So that is to say that salvation comes through the annihilation of the self. And so on the one hand, there's the kind of salvation that could come from the epitome of kind of both in the Song of Songs and in the sacrament of marriage, the kind of the epitome of the pinnacle of self-gift, which is the marital embrace, right? Where you sort of lose yourself in the other and the other loses yourself in a certain sense, but you still remain sort of distinctly yourself. But then on the other hand, there's the kind of you lose yourself into the other or into the world at the expense of a distinct separate existence, a separate soul. And so I fear that is a real kind of temptation that Paul is attracted to at the end of the novel that complicates the rekindling for me.
Yeah, I think I think you're onto something there, Joshua. A couple of thoughts came to my mind. One has to do with the issue of whether going home to his childhood home, to Paul's childhood home, represents a kind of like what that represents. To me, I think it really represents a something more like a resurrection within the framework. I mean, it's an opportunity for him to be kind of reborn. And so then my reading of his relationship with Prudence is more of just a kind of falling in love again. And of course the world falls away when you're kind of in that. And, should he live long enough to to kind of move from that into just the kind of day-to-day reality of being married, what will that mean for Paul? We don't come to know that. But I do think part of his sort of growing up again by going home uh, an interesting thing to look at is the way that his boss, Bruno Juge, lives his life. Because in a lot of ways, he's the finance minister. He's this sort of, ultimate technocrat, but also extremely, really kind of just lives a kind of non-existence. Or a kind of certainly not a kind of fully grown up existence. He just eats like frozen pizzas, and he just
It's a
lives
good
in the
point.
same place where he works, and he's not a well-formed human being at all. And his soul is certainly not well-formed. And that's clear in the way that he and pretty much everybody else thinks about these terrorist attacks. I mean, they just don't have big enough souls to really get that the threat is sort of along the lines of what Paul describes in terms of like, it's powers and principalities that we really are up against here. And I think that the kind of vague satanic threat in the background, I think that's timely. I mean, you hear now there are people sort of commenting on how what we're really, not particularly reputable people necessarily, but also not people who are these are people who have a certain following who say things like, what we're experiencing now is the door has been kicked open and the old gods have returned.
Yeah.
Sort of like in The Exorcist, where Father Merrin digs up this god in ancient Assyria and brings it back to America, and it possesses people, right? So I think that there's something like that going on
Yeah.
here. But yeah, go
But
ahead. Then I
yeah,
had
just
another
just
thought.
one other thing that kind of build on that. When Paul again is returning to his father's home, so two things. One, he in his return home is very much also, I think, in the best sense, a kind of a repudiation of the pursuit of the modern self,
Yeah.
which is basically, this myth that you have to kind of individuate to the point of leaving your family behind. You become who you are precisely by moving out of your family's home to the point of never going back, right? Intergenerational households are very rare in modernity compared to prior to it. And so, kind of a return to some semblance of that, where there are different siblings and multiple generations living under the same roof, is actually very beautiful. Um, there's also then kind of with this connection to the satanic in the novel, when he returns home, he finds that surprisingly to him, for his father being who he was reputed to be, uh, he finds that his father was reading Joseph de Maistre, right? And I'm quoting directly here from the novel. He quickly grasped the main theory of this book by Joseph de Maistre that his father was reading. Paul does, and it says the main theory is this: the French Revolution was, from start to finish, satanically inspired, and the philosophers of the Enlightenment who were its source, like Luther and like a few centuries after him, received instructions directly from the Prince of Darkness, right? So if he's suggesting that the insight here is that the French Revolution, right, had at its core a kind of satanic inspiration, then why not sort of the most revolutionary activities of our time? Why don't they have the same? Then the final thing that I would remark upon, though, with regards to this, these strange gods comment that you made, T.S. Eliot in his essay After Strange Gods, he says this is the more difficult part of this insight, is that he says the number of people in possession of any criteria for discriminating between good and evil is very small. And the number of half alive, hungry for any form of spiritual experience, high or low, good and bad, is considerable. So Eliot fears that spiritually dubious works will appeal not to those who are well and able to discriminate, but to the sick and debile and confused, and will appeal not to what remains of health in them, but to their sickness. So
Yeah.
again, my fear would be, that in spite of the fact that there might be some genuine insights in a novel like Annihilation, I'm not sure that the readership that's out there is, broadly speaking, ready to receive them, and might actually be more attracted to kind of the samsaric kind of temptation. Sorry.
Yeah, and let me throw it to Trevor, but on route to that, let me just say I think that there's, to a point that you made earlier, I think that there's something to the idea that Paul is sympathetic to Prudence's New Age religion because it's what's in his home. I mean, it's not like he resolves to kind of go check out the church, and he goes in a couple times, and he thinks like maybe I'll find out more about Catholicism. And he even says at one point something like I suspect this place and I may intersect again, or something along those lines, right? But it's like, in this sort of metaphysical desert, he's rediscovered his love for his wife, and she has these sort of spiritual views that are helpful to him, that aren't, that are kind of an escape from the kind of technocracy that he's been working in. I don't know. That's one way to think about it. But Trevor, what do you think?
Well, I wanted to add, since we've been talking about Paul in the latter sections of the novel, and the novel I think is divided into 7 parts, and uh, maybe the final aspect of the novel that I think is quite successful that I would highlight would be the last 2 parts, and in particular the last part, which I think has all the gravity and the um, you know the calm and the purposefulness, the narrative purposefulness of a really great work of art, like the final movement of a great symphony or something very, very dark. It's like a long, slow memento mori, and I think it's very effective. Um, so, yeah, as a family melodrama, I think the novel is sort of broadly successful um, at representing the crises and the existential dilemmas of the various family members. I think the portrait of the Catholic sister Cecile and her husband, and I looked up his name, Joshua. It's Hervé. I guess I was talking with Joshua. I can't remember the names of some of the characters. Um, I think they're portrayed very sympathetically, but they're not idealized. Uh, and then as a kind of descent into the underworld, into death, I think the novel is very good as well. Now, I think I agree with both of you that where some of the novel's shortcomings have to do with um, this uh, this tenuous connection between the public and the personal, or the public and the marital threads of the narrative. And I think as I was listening to you and Joshua talk about this issue of the sort of the satanic motivations of the terrorists, it occurred to me that maybe there's some kind of a narrative contradiction built into this novel, in the sense that somehow Houellebecq and his character even seem to be sympathetic to the idea that the modern world needs to be annihilated. And yet, if the impetus for that annihilation is satanic, then uh, what you're sort of implicitly acknowledging is that if the liberal state can't sort of do what it's supposed to do, and if it's collapsing, and and if the Catholic Church, as embodied in Cécile and Hervé, is sort of incapable of taking charge, then what are we left to? We sort of the best we can hope for is this kind of sort of new age remixed pagan, possibly satanic philosophy that may be animating not just the terrorists, but also sort of people in the highest levels of the French administrative state. And that's somewhat disturbing. And I think it's a real internal contradiction in the novel that surfaces like little glitches in the matrix of the books, sort of. And there's one point at which this probably is pretty apparent, and I think it's after this like metalhead has figured out where the terrorists are going to strike next, and they foil the next plot. And if I remember correctly, it's like some kind of like one of these like Bilderberg like international conferences where all of these like uber powerful tech people get together. And so there was going to be some big terrorist strike, and like all of the Zuckerbergs, everybody was just going to be wiped out. And so they thwart the attack. And then the head of the French FBI is like, well, congratulations, we did it. I'm not sure we should have foiled the attack, but that's what we did. And so this is great. And so the fact that Houellebecq doesn't really know which side he's on, whether he's on the side of the terrorist, in a sense, you could say that the terrorist is really, it's like the author himself is orchestrating. It's the only sort of consciousness, intelligence that could sort of want to destroy sperm banks and sink ships full of immigrants from Lampedusa and so on, is the author himself. He doesn't know which side he's on. And so that deprives the novel of some of the energy it should have.
I
Yeah,
think there,
well,
I mean, I think there is just really quickly, Joshua. I think there is an idea, by the way, in sort of esotericism that you kind of can't defeat the God that replaces the God. You know, like you just
mm,
can't. Like
mm,
it's just a fait accompli. So I mean, I think like this is I'm no expert on any of this, but I mean, I think this is the whole idea of like the egregores, like like the one, like the egregore that sort of like the Christian egregore has sort of like ruled Europe for all these centuries. But if it has been replaced, then it has been replaced. Like that's that, you know. So there, it doesn't mean that Christianity isn't true, but it does mean that like the the spirit of the age, like literally can't be turned.
yeah,
And I think, and then that's obviously like not an Orthodox Christian view. That is a view that has a lot of despair embedded in it. But I'm not sure that that isn't what Welbeck is saying, at least some
true.
of the time.
Yeah, I think again the question for me goes back to both Welbeck's sort of aesthetical statements and commitments, and then also just the nature of the novel as a form itself, that I think are tied up with some of these questions and some of these limitations, maybe, and some of these merits too, some of the merits of what we're describing. He, again, to return to that interview, I think with the art on the art of fiction, he says something along the lines of, I'm not a reactionary. I'm basically just describing. I'm the recording angel of the liberalization of values, basically. Don't blame me for what I'm describing. Blame the world if you have any problems. I'm just sort of refracting it for you. I'm drawing out the essence of the things that you don't, probably the rest of you don't really want to look at the heart of it. I'm going to look at the heart of it, dramatize it for you, get mad at yourselves, you know? Uh, and so on the one hand, you could say, well, he's not either accentuating or de-accentuating any of these things that he's observing. He's not celebrating or nor critiquing any of these things that he's observing. Uh, and this is, in a way, kind of part of what it means to be a novelist to an extent. And there's a recent interview with Commonweal that the American novelist Vincent Cunningham, he's a New Yorker critic who wrote a novel called Great Expectations. Somebody else wrote a novel with that same title, I think. And he, in the interview, ties the novel as a form back to the essays of Montaigne. And there's a great passage in Pierre Manent's book, Montaigne, Life Without Law. And I know that Pierre Manent is very important to Space Salve, very important to me too, life-altering writer for me, literally changed my life. He says in Montaigne, Life Without Law, the human mind spontaneously, naturally, necessarily wants to engrave where there are only fleeting lines, uncertain forms, and unforeseeable metamorphoses. So this is kind of Montaigne's idea, is that we always want more certainty than we're capable of achieving. And so the form of his essays, just like the form of the modern novel, is usually in the mood of maybe. Maybe this is the case, maybe that's the case. I'm just asking the questions. I'm not going to give any answers, right? And this leads to actually a kind of, on the one hand, a needless bifurcation, right? Because I think a writer like Flannery O'Connor rightly says that actually her doctrinal and dogmatic commitments don't get in the way of her seeing reality. They actually help her to penetrate the mysteries of reality more fully. But then on the other hand, it can lead to people who, kind of to a fault, are resisting arriving at any kinds of conclusions. So to return to that passage from Manent, right, the way that I see it is that people are inclined in our time, especially, and maybe in modernity more broadly, to draw hard and fast lines and permanent marker on issues where there should be a broad range of potential prudential disagreements that are possible, right? Like it could be this, it could be that. There's no sort of definitive dogmatic truth. But then on the other hand, where there should be dogmatic and definitive and doctrinal truths, we're inclined to just draw things in sort of erasable pencil and we say, it could be that, it could be this, it doesn't matter. And we should be saying, absolutely, you should draw a hard line, like euthanasia is innately evil, right? So I don't know. I mean, I think that it's not strange or unusual that Welbeck might be caught up with in that same kind of phenomenon of where, what is the novel's role in all of this? Is it to constantly just say maybe this, maybe that, or is it to some extent to kind of give answers? One of the things that Trevor had said early on in our conversation that I think is tied up with this is, on the one hand, there's a theory of the novel that it's basically a Protestant art form that is a kind of celebration of the Enlightenment, right? You have these protagonists who are kind of all here. The protagonists are basically just individualists, the modern individual writ large, and we care more about the protagonist's individual salvation and less about the communion of saints or the communion of the whole in the novel. But there's another kind of tradition of the novel that Trevor and I have spoken about many times, which is that is that really true? The novel also seems to be kind of giving voice to the underground of modernity, the underground of the post-Enlightenment world. And it's trying to kind of give voice and dramatization to the things that we would rather pretend don't exist. And I think that that's what, in many ways, what Houellebecq does best in my reading of him.
Yeah. And we're running out of time, but I maybe just on that note, one of the things that we've touched on, but haven't gone into great depth about is, you talked about it a few moments ago, Joshua, the depiction or the question of euthanasia, which sort of hangs over the novel. But even more than that for me is just the whole question of health, scare quotes, care that kind of hangs over the novel, right? And the whole idea of, okay, so maybe we don't have euthanasia in the United States or in some countries, but we do just stick old people in horrible places and leave them alone to die, right? So I mean, it's inhumane in a sense either way. And that does seem to me like a very, I mean, I don't know if you're putting it in the terms of like Protestant or Catholic or whatever. I mean, it is like a very Catholic thing to do, to look at those things and to want to sort of point out what's inhumane and or just frankly to see what is. And not idealize or imagine, whereas the culture does, the point you made before about the hospitals. I mean, goodness, that is so true. Like, just even look at anywhere. I mean, like cities tout their hospitals, like they're like these glass and steel monstrosities. Like they're so proud of these things, like which are just these horrible places. I don't know. I'm rambling about that, but anyway, let me throw it back to Trevor, and maybe we can kind of give our final thoughts. Trevor, any thoughts about kind of the euthanasia stuff or anything else?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the euthanasia theme is addressed most successfully by Houellebecq in his novel *The Map and the Territory*, which I think, as a novel, certainly rivals *Submission* as his most successful work. And so, yeah, I found this sort of. I agree with you. I think like the novel successfully shows that the French healthcare system is really messed up, and Europe's attitude towards death is completely mixed up. And the family melodrama comes to a satisfying climax when the whole family bands together to break Paul's father out of that sort of horrible clinic. But yeah, I didn't find the way that I didn't think it really succeeded in addressing the euthanasia theme head on, because that wasn't what Paul's father was sort of specifically facing.
Right.
And so that's why I think Houellebecq had to include this long sort of theoretical discourse from the leader of the group that helped break Paul's father out of this clinic. And I mean, I think it's a very interesting discourse. It's more of an anti-modern attitude towards the whole question than it is a Catholic one, because there's sort of somehow old people are sort of lionized at the expense of young people in this theoretical discourse. But yeah, nevertheless, I mean, it does a good job taking on all these questions, and it certainly raises a lot of them. I mean, I guess if I had to sort of make one concluding remark, it would be that the editor of Compact, Jeff Schellenberger, actually wrote a couple of paragraphs on this novel in the Compact Substack, and he made a very interesting observation about the link between the novel as a genre and the rise of the nation state. And he said that the surname of the hero's family, Raison, is a reference to reason, and it's sort of the reason of the modern state. And he points out that the modern state is not just it's not just a form of social organization; it's actually a way of seeing. So that the modern state wants to homogenize life and to erase certain local particularities and customs in order to make economies of scale possible and sort of total state control possible. And somehow the novel, and Joshua was just talking about this, sort of like the novel as a way of revealing the dark side or the shadow side of liberalism or of the modern project. The novel emerges at the same time as the state does. And if this novel, Annihilation, is about the breakdown of the modern state and its incapacity to organize life and to, make French society functional and to serve its citizens, then that also, and this is Schellenberger's idea, which I think is provocative and very interesting and worth discussing, that also suggests that somehow the novel is facing a similar crisis. And I think that this novel very much bears that out, but maybe especially in its inability to sort of take its terrorist plot, the plot with which the novel opens, seriously enough to make it truly gripping and convincing, and to connect it to the individual lives of the characters. So it's a novel of Balzacian ambitions, which I think succeeds in many ways, but in many other ways falls short, but for reasons that maybe are less an indictment of Houellebecq as a novelist than a reflection of a particular cultural phase that we
Yeah.
find ourselves in.
I think, I think I would just say in closing, kind of building off of what you were getting at about the kind of parallels that exist between our own society in the States and some of the things that are being diagnosed and kind of satirized in Europe. I talked about, the therapy dogs on campus during final exam week. That's just the beginning, right? I mean, I remember during the 2008 crisis, miraculously, in spite of the fact that we were going through an economic depression that was supposedly destroying the nation, suddenly all these doggy daycares started to open up in the city of Milwaukee, and I just couldn't fathom, what this meant, other than that it was a kind of desperate pursuit of infantilization and kind of a pursuit of post-humanity in the face of human limitation. In the novel that I'm working on, so I think that the highest compliment that you can pay any other novelist is really to write a novel that is in part kind of in conversation with or in dialogue with that novelist, or to write another work of art. I mean, I wrote the piece for First Things, and essays and criticism certainly have their place in drawing out elements of a novel that are not immediately evident. But the limitations of sort of just more criticism without there being more fiction, I think, are obvious. And so I'm working on a novel called The Hotel Dieu right now, and it is the third in a trilogy that starts with Infinite Regress, includes Blue Walls Falling Down. The trilogy is called The Accidental Family, and it takes place largely in the city of Milwaukee, and it's built around this attempt on the part of a priest named Father Marteau to build a kind of imitation of a hospital, a famous hospital in Paris called the Hotel Dieu, which was one of the earliest hospitals in France devoted to the care of the indigent who could not afford that kind of care. And what Father Marteau is disturbed and disgusted by is the way in which we do put our sick and our suffering into some of the ugliest and most hideous buildings and places that we have available. And this is borne out by a poem by Dana Gioia, one of our great living Catholic poets, called Special Treatments Ward. And he says in this poem, "So this is where the children come to die, hidden on the hospital's highest floor. They wear their bandages like uniforms." And so he really said, the highest floor. Typically that would be right, like symbolically that should mean that's where the best of the best go, right? We elevate what's highest. We put at the top. But in this case, we put these sick and suffering children on the highest floor of the hospital because we can't bear to look at them. We want to pretend away their existence. We want to do the opposite of what Ivan does in the Rebellion chapter of the Brothers Karamazov, where he has like a folder full of all the things that suffering children have ever gone through in the history of Russia. We want to do the opposite of that and pretend that that kind of suffering doesn't exist at all. So he wants to build this kind of somewhat anachronistic and totally out of place in the middle of the inner city of Milwaukee, this imitation of the Hotel Dieu, this beautiful architecture. And he wants to bring those who are diagnosed with illnesses that are incurable to die in this beautiful place as a kind of embodiment or a prefigurement, you could say, of the kind of the logic of paradise that typically defies our own. And of course, much of the novel will deal with in a comic way, the foibles that come along in his attempt to try to do something like that. But I very much think that there are aspects of the novel, The Hotel Jew, that I'm working on right now that I couldn't really have imagined working on without reading Houellebecq's Annihilation, right?
Hmm.
And so this is sort of why this is um, there's a kind of conversation that's happening, I think, from any of us who are working now, back to Houellebecq, back to Balzac, and there's a real kind of deep sense of tradition and indebtedness to going all the way back to the one of the great practitioners of the form, which is Balzac and his Human Comedy. And I think for us as Catholic writers, one of the tricks is to try to combine some of the pursuits of the Divine Comedy of Dante, which is sort of getting at the unseen realities, and combine them with a great realist tradition, which is sort of seeing in an unflinching way the world as it really is around us. So that was a little bit long, but thanks for bearing with me.
Well, we look forward to reading, of course, reading that new novel. And by the way, I will just say I'll take the last word here and say that Houellebecq does actually stick up for the novel in the novel. In the scene when Paul is suffering, the only thing he can do is read, and he's reading Sherlock Holmes stories. And Houellebecq says he needed the narration of the lives of others than his own. What else but a book could have produced such an effect? So I think that's encouraging, actually. Whether the world is going to hell or not, whether the novel is dying or not, it's still a great thing that people are reading novels like we are, and that and some people are even daring to write novels too. So let's give thanks for that. Let's hope too that maybe we get more from Houellebecq. He says in the acknowledgments page, "By chance, I have reached a positive conclusion. It's time for me to stop." So let's hope not, but it is time for us to stop. So on that note, Joshua Hren, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much. This was a total joy.
And Trevor Merrill, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks very much, Andrew.
And to all of our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for taking the time to pay attention to a conversation like this, and to all of the good ones that we're curating now in our library at the Spe Salvi Institute. So until next time, God bless and live in hope.